My name is Daniel, and I've always been afraid of basements. Even as a kid, I hated going down to the one in our old house. It always felt colder than the rest of the house, darker too, like something was hiding in the shadows. I didn't have a reason for the fear back then, but now I do. It all started when I moved into my new apartment. I'd been living in the city for a few years, but rent was high, and I was getting tired of cramped spaces and noisy neighbors. So, when I found a decently priced one-bedroom apartment just outside the city, I jumped on it. The building was older, but it had charm, brick walls, high ceilings, and most importantly, it was affordable. The landlord, Mr. Harris, seemed like a nice enough guy. He mentioned the building had been standing for over a century, which explained the creaky floors and occasional draft, but it didn't bother me at first. I figured I'd just fix things up little by little. After signing the lease, Mr. Harris handed me a set of keys, including one for the basement. "There's a laundry room down there," he said, his voice low as if he didn't want to mention it. "Just be careful. The lights can be a bit temperamental." I didn't think much of it at the time. The basement wasn't something I planned on using all that often. I figured I'd do laundry somewhere else if it was too creepy. My first couple of weeks in the apartment were quiet. I got used to the old building's quirks, the strange noises at night, the occasional flicker of lights, and the draft that always seemed to come from the basement door at the end of the hallway. Still, nothing really set off any alarm bells. That is, until one evening when I decided to do laundry. It was a Saturday night, and I was out of clean clothes. I debated going to the laundromat, but it was cold, and the idea of lugging my laundry bag across town wasn't appealing. Reluctantly, I grabbed my basket and headed toward the basement. The door at the end of the hallway creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down into the darkness. I reached for the light switch, but when I flicked it on, only a faint glow lit the steps. The rest of the basement was shrouded in shadow. I hesitated. Maybe I should just wait until tomorrow and go to the laundromat, but I was already here, and the thought of clean clothes was enough to push me forward. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The basement smelled old, like damp concrete and mildew. The air was cooler down there, and my breath came out in little puffs as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The laundry room was at the far end of the basement, past a maze of old storage lockers and forgotten junk. I could barely see, but the faint light from the stairwell cast long shadows on the walls. Every creak of the floor above, every drip of water from the pipes, made me jump. I hurried over to the washing machines, quickly dumping my clothes into one of them and starting the cycle. The steady hum of the machine was almost comforting, a break from the oppressive silence that filled the basement. I sat on one of the old wooden benches by the wall, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging against wood or concrete. At first I thought it was the pipes, maybe the old building settling. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I froze, my heart racing. I looked around the dimly lit basement, but nothing seemed out of place. The storage lockers were still closed, the shadows on the walls hadn't moved. Yet the scratching continued, echoing through the room. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, near the old storage lockers. I stood up, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. Maybe it was a rat, I told myself, or some other animal that had gotten trapped down here. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The scratching was too deliberate, too steady. It sounded like someone or something was trying to claw its way out. I took a step toward the lockers, my breath catching in my throat. I knew I should go back upstairs, forget about the laundry and leave. But something kept pulling me forward, like I had to know what was making that noise. The closer I got to the lockers, the colder the air became. It felt like the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. My hands were shaking, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I reached the row of lockers and hesitated. They were old, made of rusted metal, the doors dented and covered in dust. The one at the very end was slightly ajar, its lock broken. That's when I heard it again, a faint whisper, like someone speaking just below the edge of hearing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. But it wasn't words. It was more like a chant, low, guttural, and filled with something dark and menacing. Without thinking, I grabbed the door of the locker and yanked it open. At first there was nothing, just darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something at the back of the locker. A small, dusty box, tucked away in the shadows. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment I touched it, the air in the basement seemed to shift, like something had woken up. The whispering grew louder, and I stumbled back, clutching the box in my hands. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could feel something watching me, its presence heavy and oppressive. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back up the stairs and never come back, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were stuck in place, and my hands were locked around the box, unable to let go. The whispering was deafening now, filling my ears with a language I didn't understand. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My head throbbed, and I felt like I was going to collapse. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The basement was silent again. The cold air dissipated, and I could move. I took a deep, shaky breath and looked down at the box in my hands. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, made of tarnished metal with strange symbols etched into the lid. My hands were shaking as I turned it over, trying to find a way to open it. A sudden creak from behind me made me jump, and I spun around, my heart racing. The basement was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I needed to get out of there, now. I grabbed my laundry from the machine, still wet, and rushed up the stairs, leaving the basement door swinging behind me. The moment I stepped into my apartment, I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. I collapsed onto the couch, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared down at the box in my lap. What had I found? And what had I just let out? For hours I sat there, staring at the box, too afraid to open it but too curious to leave it alone. I could still hear the faint whispering, just on the edge of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Finally, unable to take it any longer, I reached for the lid and pried it open. Inside was something I couldn't have expected. A small, withered hand, curled into a fist, sat on a bed of blackened fabric. The skin was dried and cracked, like it had been mummified, and the fingers were twisted in unnatural ways. A deep sense of dread washed over me, and I felt like I was going to be sick. That's when I noticed the writing on the inside of the lid. It was in the same strange language as the symbols on the outside, but one word stood out, one word that I could understand. Curse. Shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispering was louder now, filling the room, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could hear were the whispers, growing louder and louder until they were all I knew, and went out. I sat in the darkness, the box still in my lap, the whispering surrounding me. I could feel it now, the presence in the room, watching me, waiting. I was trapped. My name is James, and I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a practical guy, focused on work and keeping my life simple. But that all changed the day I bought an old house in the countryside. I was in need of a fresh start after my job as a mechanic became unbearable due to a string of bad luck and layoffs. So, I packed up my life in the city and moved to a quiet town a few hours away. The house I bought was a fixer-upper, but it was affordable and had plenty of space. The basement, however, was another story. From the moment I saw the place, something about the basement felt wrong. It was unfinished, with cold concrete floors and exposed beams running across the ceiling. There was a faint musty smell, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. But that's what you expect from an old house, right? Or so I thought. I figured I'd get around to fixing up the basement eventually, but it wasn't a priority. I planned to use it for storage, so I didn't need to go down there often. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling every time I passed the door to the basement at the end of the hallway. It always seemed colder near that door, even on warm days. At night, after I had been living in the house for about a month, I was in bed trying to sleep, but something kept me awake. At first, it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling, but then I heard something more, a faint thumping sound coming from beneath me. It sounded like someone, or something, was moving around in the basement. I told myself it was just the pipes or maybe an animal that had gotten trapped down there. But the thumping continued, steady and deliberate. My heart started racing, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening intently. It was probably just a raccoon, I told myself, or maybe a stray cat that had found a way into the house. But I couldn't convince myself that it was just an animal. The sound was too rhythmic, too precise. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and got out of bed. I wasn't the type to call the police over every little noise, so I figured I'd just go down there and check it out myself. I told myself that once I saw it was nothing, I'd be able to sleep. The hallway was quiet as I made my way to the basement door. I stood in front of it for a moment, hesitating. The air around me felt colder, and I could almost feel a slight draft coming from underneath the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for the first time in years, I felt a pang of real fear. I swallowed hard and opened the door. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended into the basement. The flashlight's beam barely cut through the darkness, and I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the thumping stopped. The basement was still, as though it had never made a sound. I shone the light around the room, scanning the empty space. Old boxes were piled against the far wall, and the water heater hummed softly in the corner. There was nothing unusual, just an old, unfinished basement. But then, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the basement, where the light barely reached, there was a small door I hadn't noticed before. It was low to the ground, almost hidden behind a pile of old wood. The door was made of dark wood, with a rusted iron latch. It looked old, much older than the rest of the house. My pulse quickened as I approached it. The air around the door felt colder, and that uneasy feeling from earlier grew stronger. I knelt down, examining the door closely. There was no lock, just the iron latch that had rusted shut. I had to know what was behind it. Gripping the latch with both hands, I tugged hard, the rusted metal protesting as it finally gave way with a loud creak. The door swung open slowly, revealing a small, dark crawl space beyond it. The smell that hit me was overwhelming, damp, moldy, and something else I couldn't place. Something almost rotten. I hesitated for a moment before shining the flashlight inside. At first, I couldn't see anything. The crawl space seemed to go deeper than I had expected, but the flashlight barely reached the back. I thought I saw something move, a slight shift in the darkness, but I couldn't be sure. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned in closer. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy whisper. "James." I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as the light flickered on the floor, casting eerie shadows across the basement. I scrambled to grab it, shining it toward the crawl space again. But there was nothing there, just darkness. My mind raced. I had heard my name clear as day, but there was no one in the basement. I stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And then, from deep within the crawl space, the whisper came again. "James, help me." I backed away, my hands shaking as I pointed the flashlight at the small door. The voice was faint, but it was real. It was coming from inside the crawl space. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, to run back upstairs and never come back. But something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe, or fear of leaving whatever was down there unchecked. I took a deep breath and called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" For a moment, there was only silence. And then, slowly, the voice answered, "I've been waiting for you, for so long." I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The voice was weak, almost pitiful, but there was something dark beneath it, something that made my blood run cold. I couldn't stay in the basement any longer. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was still racing as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. The house was quiet, but I could still feel the cold creeping through the floorboard. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept hearing the whisper in my mind replaying over and over, "I've been waiting for you." The next day, I decided to seal the basement door. I wasn't going back down there, not after what had happened. I bought heavy-duty locks and even nailed a few boards over the doorframe, determined to keep whatever was down there locked away. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night I heard them, faint at first but growing louder as the nights went on. "James, come back," they would say. "James, help, Mem." I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the whispers followed me, seeping into my dreams. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. And then, one night, the whispers changed. They weren't asking for help anymore. They weren't weak or pitiful. They were angry. "James, you can't hide from me." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing as the voice echoed in my mind. It was no longer a faint whisper, it was loud, demanding. Whatever was down there wanted out. I packed up my things the next day and left the house, not even bothering to tell anyone where I was going. I couldn't stay there, not with that thing in the basement. I never went back. I don't know what I let out that night, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, even now, I can still hear the whisper in the back of my mind. "James, I'm still waiting." My name is Ethan, and I'm not one to scare easily. I've always prided myself on being a rational person, someone who needs hard facts to believe in anything. Ghosts, spirits, and all that supernatural nonsense? Not for me. Or at least, that's how I used to feel, until I spent a week at my uncle's old house. My uncle passed away unexpectedly a few months ago, and I inherited his house. It was a large Victorian-style mansion that had been in our family for generations. I didn't know him well, he was always distant, and we rarely spoke. But when the house became mine, I figured I'd take a week off from work, drive out there, and see what I was dealing with. If it was in good shape, I'd sell it. If not, I'd fix it up. Simple, right? That was beautiful, but in a state of disrepair. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. It had a certain charm, though, and despite its age, the place felt sturdy. The only strange thing was that one of the rooms on the second floor was locked. I tried every key my uncle had left behind, but none of them worked on that door. It was an odd thing, but I didn't think much of it at first. I figured there was probably nothing in there but old furniture or junk. Still, the more I walked past it, the more curious I became. The first house were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning up, exploring the old rooms, and making notes of repairs that needed to be done. The nights were quiet, except for the occasional groan of the old house settling. I never had trouble sleeping until the third night. It ain't sound, something that woke me in the middle of the night. I sat up in bed listening carefully. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, but then I realized it was coming from inside the house. A slow, rhythmic tapping. And got out of bed, the sound growing louder as I moved into the hallway. The tapping seemed to be coming from the second floor, near the locked room. I made my way up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I reached the top, the tapping stopped. I stood there in the dark hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the locked door. Everything was still. I waited for a moment, straining to hear anything, but the house had gone completely silent. Feeling ridiculous for letting myself get spooked, I turned to go back downstairs. That's when I heard it again, louder this tap, T-tap, dot, tap. It was coming from inside the locked room. I froze, my hand gripping the banister. For a moment, I considered going back to bed and ignoring it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or some animal that had gotten trapped inside. But my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my toolbox from downstairs and made my way back to the locked room. If there was something or someone in there, I wanted to know. Using a screwdriver, I pried the lock loose. It took a bit of effort, but after a few minutes, the door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan. The room was dark, and the air was stale, as if it hadn't been opened in years. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. It was a small bedroom, mostly empty except for an old wooden bed and a wardrobe in the corner. The wallpaper was faded, and the windows were covered in thick dust. Nothing seemed out of place, but the tapping had definitely come from here. I walked around the room, inspecting everything. The bed was bare, the wardrobe empty. There was nothing that could have made the noise. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd. The floorboards near the bed seemed loose. I crouched down and shone the flashlight on the floor. Sure enough, one of the boards was slightly raised, as if someone had pried it up before. My heart raced as I wedged the screwdriver underneath the board and lifted it. It was a small wooden box. It was old, the wood worn and splintered, with strange symbols carved into the lid. A chill ran down my spine as I lifted the box out of the floor. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened it. Inside was a stack of yellowed letters, tied together with a piece of frayed string. They looked ancient, and the handwriting on the outside was delicate, almost like it had been written by a child. I untied the string and carefully unfolded the first letter. The words were faded, but I could still make them out. To whoever finds this, please forgive me. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't mean to let it out. My hands trembled as I read the rest of the letter. It told the story of a woman, the original owner of the house, who had lived there over a century ago. She wrote about a presence in the house, something dark and malevolent that she had accidentally awakened. She had locked it away in this very room, sealing it with the strange symbols on the box. The last lines of the letter sent a shiver through me. It knocks to remind me it's still there. It wants out. And I'm afraid that one day, someone will let it free. Suddenly, the room felt colder, and I could feel something watching me. I slowly backed toward the door, my heart racing. As I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The tapping started again, louder, more frantic. I dropped the letters and ran to the door, pulling at the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping turned into banging, as if something was pounding on the walls, desperate to get out. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one could hear me. The banging grew louder, shaking the very walls of the room. And then, in the pitch-black darkness, I heard it, a whisper, low and menacing, coming from behind me. The door flew open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I never went back to that house. I sold it as soon as I could, warning the new owners about the locked room. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the tapping. It's still in there. And it's waiting for someone else to let it out.